Okay, I made an add-on for Blender, and I think it's pretty neat. I call it Imposter Cards, Nacho Time. It brings an LOD system back into Blender. Instead of replacing distant high-poly objects with reduced polygonal objects to improve performance, it skips reducing polygons by baking a shader-based proxy to a single plane. These imposter cards are always facing the camera, but there's a shader within that allows you to see the object from multiple vantage points. Here is a fantastic tape deck model from polyhaven.com. It has a fairly dense, detailed mesh, and its own principled shader using high-resolution diffuse, metallic, roughness, normal, and opacity texture maps. Beyond polygonal reduction, there are a number of shader-based LOD solutions that designers can implement to simplify an object like this tape deck. One option is a front-facing billboard. It's a single plane with track-to-camera behavior and a static image of the object. For many objects, like tape decks, the illusion breaks down. For example, it does not show the back of the object or any real depth. You can add a plane to it. Multi-plane billboards offer different vantage points of the object. They can sometimes create unfortunate mesh intersections, so the result can look messy. For some assets, though, it works really well, like pine trees. But this has a trade-off of using many faces, reducing performance. Now here's one of my favorite Blender add-ons, Instant Impostors. This solution creates a convex cave mesh around a shader that features an orthographically rendered image of the asset from many possible viewing angles. As the incoming coordinates change, the displayed angle of the object updates. You can see that there is a stepping effect as the angle changes. It relies on a full texture sprite sheet of the object, including albedo, normal, and emit sprite sheets. It also offers view interpolation, which adds noise between the visual jumps from one angle to another so it looks smoother. And this is my add-on, Imposter Cards Nacho Time. It generates a single plane with a shader that doesn't suffer from the stepping artifact. In contrast to traditional octahedral imposter card setups, it uses minimal texture memory to create a convincing facsimile of the original object. Instead of storing the information for one object in 3 texture atlases, it uses a clever packing system to store up to 60 unique items in a normal, diffuse, and roughness texture. With one click, you can convert all your objects into imposter cards. Since the imposters all share the same texture information and material, it results in a single draw call, making it more efficient, rather than each unique imposter card having its own shader and textures. My add-on excels at cuboid and rectangular shapes, but it also works very well for trees and organic forms. In effect, it can produce the look of a multi-plane mesh billboard using only a single face. Once the imposter card has been generated, you can edit it using the imposter editor. The add-on has 2 level of detail modes. One is where you simply generate a duplicate imposter card of your high poly mesh, or you can enable dynamic mode. When you generate your imposter cards with dynamic mode activated, your high poly mesh will automatically switch to the low poly imposter card based on camera distance or view distance. You can also change the imposter threshold, which changes the distance from which the high poly switches to the low poly imposter card. You can see here the changeout taking place. The low poly imposter cards switch to become their high poly counterparts when they get close enough to the camera. From 8 meters away, the change from high poly mesh to low poly imposter card is nearly imperceptible. From 15 meters away, the effect is invisible. When lit by direct lighting, the normals ensure that it still appears as though it's a 3D object. You can choose between low, medium, or high shader complexity. High setting generates a principled shader that uses normal, roughness, metallic, and diffuse, consolidated into 3 textures. Medium is a glossy and diffuse mixed shader, only requiring 2 textures, diffuse and normal. Low is the simplest and the most efficient. It uses only a diffuse shader with normal and diffuse texture maps. Using the low shader complexity is usually sufficient for most distant objects. To improve memory usage and performance, users can set the texture resolution of the imposter cards. Okay, so why did I make this? I created this add-on as a pipeline tool for a video game that I made in the Up Blender game engine. The game is available on Steam. It's called The Shadows Lengthen. It runs on the traditional Blender game engine renderer. Now, with the Up Blender game engine, I've been working to convert my game to the Eevee render engine. And so I organically came to create this add-on to help with texture memory management and polygon management in the scene. At first I pushed forward using instant imposters. I tried to reduce the number of objects that would be imposters, and I tried to scale down the texture atlases, and even consolidating them into single UDIM textures so that they could all live under one shader. Unfortunately, instant imposters, while great for large scenes with single objects, doesn't work well for a video game that has a game object library of over 217 unique assets. I quickly did the mental math, and I said, okay, 217 times 3, whoa, that's a lot of textures. When I imported these assets into the game engine, I realized there was a new visual artifact that I couldn't get around. I made a mini sci-fi game to show this artifact. On the left are yellow crates created by the Instant Impostors add-on. On the right side, imposters have been generated with Nacho Time. In the center of the room is the high poly mesh crate. The distortion to what I call a packed sprite sheet imposter card happens because all the objects in that sprite sheet are packed in an orthographic rendered perspective. So as you come closer to one of these objects, it doesn't offer true camera distortion. Nacho Time gives realistic perspective distortion because it takes the object coordinates and the incoming vector, distorts these vectors to create a pseudo 3D plane. The shader then reconstructs that object using those pseudo 3D planes. Here's a visual example of how that's working. Instead of requiring multiple renders of the same image from different angles, it only needs 6 orthogonal shots rendered to a texture, using a fraction of the texture memory necessary. When you compare different styles of imposter cards with this tape deck, Nacho Time is the clear standout. However, what happens if you use non-cuboid or rectanguloid shapes? In those instances, you can also choose to use the Ultra render setting. This creates the same effect as before, but allows you to create slices, creating a parallax depth effect in your imposter card. You can also adjust the depth of the faces, the threshold for when it switches to its low poly counterpart. Additionally, you can choose the number of slices that the depth parallax will have. After I published this on BlenderMarket.com, now called Superhive, multiple 3D artists have reached out to me. They told me that I've created a more robust version of USD cards, or imposter cards, in typical 3D production pipelines for real-time and also for studios. You can have a grocery store completely chock-a-block full of items and render the entire scene in seconds. If you're an artist or a studio using Blender professionally, solutions like my add-on are industry proven and pretty vital. So, I guess I kind of organically created a tool that's already used in a lot of professional pipelines. Now it exists in Blender, and it's super cool. The link to my add-on is in the description of this video, down below, and thank you for watching.